criteria or standards of method and thus do not qualify as genuine scientific theories or explanations. So let us look closely at these demarcation criteria. Do they provide what is needed, namely a principled, philosophical, or methodological reason for supporting methodological naturalism? Do the criteria enable scientists or philosophers to define the practice of science in a normative way? Do the criteria justifiably exclude a priori some theories as unscientific or pseudoscientific, that is, irrespective of what the evidence may show? Wherever you see green ellipses, those are where I'm omitting material from the book. 4. A conversation about methodological naturalism and what wasn't said. On rare occasions in the life of a student, something so significant happens in conversation with an older mentor or scholar that the episode determines the future thinking of that student. Such a conversation happened to one of us, Paul Nelson, in October 1983 while he was still an undergraduate studying the philosophy of science and evolutionary biology at the University of Pittsburgh. The episode, a discussion about methodological naturalism with the distinguished historian of science Ronald Numbers, as some of you may know, is worth recounting, and it illuminates the central problem with methodological naturalism, in particular with methodological naturalism's putatively objective standing as a ground rule for science. Numbers is a professor of the history of science at the University of Wisconsin and one of the world's leading scholars on the relationship of science and religion. In 1983, he received a fellowship from the Guggenheim Foundation to write a history of American creationism. He had learned that Paul possessed some historically valuable correspondence and papers belonging to his grandfather, Byron C. Nelson, an influential early 20th century creationist. At the time, Paul was preparing to write his senior thesis in the philosophy of science on the topic of intelligent design in biology. For Darwin, design was not only a live possibility, but represented the central target of his argument in The Origin of Species. In other words, design might have been true. I can entertain no doubts, wrote Darwin, that the view which most naturalists entertain, and which I formally entertain, namely that each species has been independently created, is erroneous. But whatever can be false, erroneous in Darwin's words, could by logical symmetry also be true. The evidence should decide, except that methodological naturalism says otherwise. Never mind the evidence, design categorically may not be considered as an empirical possibility. The statements of science as a national academy must invoke only natural things and processes, regardless of the evidence. Over lunch, Paul presented this philosophical incongruity to Numbers. Methodological naturalism seemed arbitrary at best, Paul said. If design can be false, as Darwin argued, then it might also be true. Whatever philosophy of science we adopt, therefore, should allow for both possibilities, letting the evidence determine the outcome. Right. Without looking up from his food, Numbers nodded his agreement, but only with the possibility of intelligent design. Of course, intelligent design is possible, he replied, but that isn't the issue. Look, he went on. Why is it that in baseball, when one hits the ball outside of the first or third base lines, that is a foul ball, one cannot run to first base? Baseball has its rules, he said, answering his own question. So does science. Since the rise to dominance of scientific materialism in the 19th century, the rules of science have included methodological naturalism. That may strike you as unfair, Numbers acknowledged, but that is how the game of science has been played for a long time now, and it's not going to change. If you want to participate, follow the rules, or find another game. What struck Paul most powerfully at that moment, and what has influenced his thinking ever since, is what Numbers did not say at the lunch table that afternoon. Demarcation criteria work, except when they don't. Numbers did not support methodological naturalism by appealing to any of the familiar and supposedly neutral methodological criteria used to define and demarcate science, such as observability, testability, falsifiability, or explanation by reference to natural law. He didn't even try. And there are good reasons for that. Historians and philosophers of science have long known that attempts to define science by reference to abstract demarcation criteria have failed. In particular, the attempt to define science normatively by such criteria has inevitably died by 1,000 counterexamples. Many highly esteemed theories lack some of the allegedly necessary features of science. Demarcation criteria typically either exclude too much already established science. For instance, physics, Newton's Principia and his optics, both of which carry significant theological content, then fail to meet specific demarcation criteria, see below, or inadvertently to cut the legs out from under current research fields generally regarded as scientific, such as cosmology, theoretical physics, historical geology, psychology, or even evolutionary biology itself. The failure of demarcation criteria became a public issue in the immediate wake of a famous court trial that was decided shortly before Nelson's conversation with Numbers. In January 1982, federal judge William Overton overturned an Arkansas law requiring the teaching of creationism alongside evolution in the Arkansas public schools. To justify his ruling in the McLean versus Arkansas case, Overton cited demarcation criteria which he claimed science could be defined normatively and against which creationism could be measured to determine whether it qualified as a scientific theory. 1, being guided by natural law. You've seen these before, haven't you? Explaining by reference to natural law. 3, being testable against the empirical world. And 4, being falsifiable. And others. Within months of the ruling, the adequacy of the McLean criteria and Overton's use of demarcation criteria generally had come under blistering attack from philosophers of science, with no sympathies for creationism, incidentally. No criteria comprehensively captured the features of science, to the exclusion of metaphysics, theology, or other knowledge claims, such that scientists, philosophers, or federal judges, for that matter, could decide if any theory was scientific without ever examining the relevant empirical evidence. Consider the second of Judge Overton's criteria, explanation by natural law. Larry Loudon, an expert on the demarcation problem, and an atheist, could barely restrain his contempt for the dismal inadequacy of the natural law rule. To suggest, as the McLean opinion does repeatedly, that an existence claims is unscientific until we have found the laws on which the alleged phenomenon depends is simply outrageous. Galileo and Newton took themselves to establish the existence of gravitational phenomena long before anyone was able to give a causal explanatory account of gravitation. Darwin took himself to have established the existence of natural selection almost a half a century before geneticists were able to lay out the laws of heredity on which natural selection depended. If we took the McLean opinion criterion seriously, we should have to say that Newton and Darwin were unscientific. And to take an example example, from our own time, it would follow that plate tectonics is unscientific because we have not yet identified the laws of physics and chemistry which account for the dynamics of crustal motion. Skipping a paragraph, in any case, natural laws are often used to describe but not explain natural phenomena. Newton famously declared that he did not know the cause of universal gravitation. Hypotheses non fingo, as he said in Latin, which means I don't frame any hypotheses. Conversely, many other scientists do offer causal explanations, but they do so not primarily by citing general laws, but instead by citing past events. Historical science, including evolutionary biology, for example, typically explain particular events in the past by citing prior events and conditions that played a causal role in producing the events in question. And they give the example of the Himalayas, which we'll skip in order to save time. Or consider testability, another key MacLean demarcation criterion. Judge Overton's ruling stated that creationism was not testable and thus could not be considered scientific. Ironically, just as the criterion of must be explained by natural law can be applied in such a way as to render both Newtonian physics and Darwinian biology unscientific, the criterion of testability can be rendered in such a way as to show creationism as a completely scientific research program. And that, of course, is what is done with soft sediment deformation and carbon-14 dating, and all of the finding of soft tissues in dinosaurs. Indeed, in The Origin of Species, Darwin built an evidential case against special creation precisely by testing and finding wanting the special creationist theories of his time. Consequently, by Overton's own rationale, creationism could legitimately be taught in public school science classrooms, contra his ruling. One measuring stick for everyone, the methodological equivalence of materialistic and non-materialistic, that is, design-based theories. Moreover, the failure of demarcation criteria to distinguish scientific from non-scientific theories applies in spades when considering materialistic versus non-materialistic or design-based origins theories. Hence, these criteria cannot justify methodological naturalism. While researching the demarcation problem, one of us, another one, Stephen Meyer, discovered an unexpected equivalence between materialistic and design-based theories with respect to their ability to meet a whole range of demarcation criteria. He has found that, invariably, if the critics of non-materialistic theories such as intelligent design apply definitional criteria such as observability, testability, or law-like explanation in a strict way, then these criteria not only disqualify the design hypothesis from consideration of science, they also disqualify their chief materialistic rivals, other historical scientific theories that invoke only undirected evolutionary processes. Conversely, if definitional and demarcational criteria are applied in a less restrictive way, perhaps the one that takes into account the distinctive historical aspects of inquiry into biological origins, then these criteria not only establish the scientific bona fides of various fully materialistic theories, rivals of intelligent design, they also confirm the scientific status of the design hypothesis and other non-materialistic theories as well. Theories invoking creative intelligence and their strictly materialistic rivals are equivalent in their ability to meet various demarcation criteria or methodological norms. To illustrate this equivalence in the cases of theories of biological origins, let's look at two widely cited demarcation criteria, one of which was used in the Arkansas trial, and another that has been used by opponents of the theory of intelligent design, which was not yet on trial in Arkansas. Lawful explanation. We saw already that many scientific theories do not explain by citing natural law. Some do not offer explanations at all. They describe but do not explain using laws of nature. Other sciences do offer explanations, but they do so by reference to causal events rather than general laws of nature. Many historical scientific theories do not explain primarily by natural law. Instead, they postulate past events or patterns of events to explain other past events as well as to presently observable evidence. Many historical scientific theories make no mention of laws at all. Laws at best play only a secondary role in historical scientific theories. Instead, events play the primary explanatory role. Ironically, as if to underscore this point, Michael Ruse, who offered the must explain by natural law criterion at the Arkansas trial, himself has noted that it is probably a mistake to think of modern evolutionists as seeking universal laws at work in every situation. Wow. Advocates of intelligent design use a law. Since there is no informational free lunch, the origin of complex specified information always requires intelligent input to justify their inference to a past causal event, namely the act of a designing mind. Observability. We have discovered a similar equivalence with respect to every other demarcation criteria that we've examined. Consider, for example, the oft-cited criterion of observability. According to critics of intelligent design, the unobservable character of a designing intelligence renders it inaccessible to empirical investigation and therefore makes it unscientific. For example, in 1993, biophysicist Gene Kenyon was removed from teaching his introductory biology class at San Francisco State University after he discussed his reasons for supporting intelligent design with his students. His department colleagues believed their actions against him were justified because they believed that he had been discussing an unscientific theory with his class. Some of Kenyon's colleagues argued that the theory of intelligent design did not qualify as a scientific theory because it invoked an unobservable entity, in particular an unseen designing intelligence. In making this argument, Kenyon's colleagues assumed that the scientific theories must invoke only observable entities. Since Kenyon discussed a theory that violated this convention, they insisted that neither the theory he discussed nor he himself belonged to the biology classroom. Theory unscientific. The answer depends again on how science is defined. If scientists and all other relevant parties decide to define science as an enterprise in which scientists can posit only observable case or events in their theories, then clearly the theory of intelligent design would not qualify as a scientific theory. But this definition of science would render many other scientific theories, including many evolutionary theories of biological origin, unscientific by definition as well. Many scientific theories infer or postulate unobservable entities, causes, and events. Physical forces, electromagnetic or gravitational fields, atoms, quarks, past events, subsurface geological features, biomolecular structures, all are unobservable entities inferred from observable evidence. naturalists. Materialistic evolutionary theories also infer or postulate past unobservable events. Theories of chemical evolution invoke past events as part of the stories they use to explain how the first living cells arose. Neo-Darwinian biologists for their part have advocated the putatively unfalsifiable nature of their claims by reminding critics of many of the creative processes to which they refer occur at rates too slow to observe in the present and too fast to have been recorded in the fossil record. So they're not observable. Furthermore, the existence of many transitional and immediate forms of life are also unobservable. Skipping over a little bit, it has been said that behind every double standard lies a single hidden agenda. It takes only a smattering of philosophical training and even less historical sophistication to see that the flawed demarcation criteria cited in McLean had been specially contrived by the Axionian who tried to discredit creationism. There is no philosophical shortcut to empirical truth. The permitted versus the possible. Science is an open-ended quest. Thus far, the arguments advanced in support of a naturalistic definition of science have provided a justification for methodological naturalism. Nevertheless, perhaps such arguments are irrelevant. Perhaps scientists should just accept the definition of science that has come down to them after all. Thousands of materialistic processes that serve science well. What compelling reason can be offered for overturning the prohibition against design-based explanations in science? What harm can come from continuing with the status quo? In fact, methodological naturalism damages science for several interrelated reasons. First, with respect to legends, defining science as a strictly materialistic enterprise limits the ability of scientists to determine the truth, to find out what actually happened to cause life to arise on Earth. Consider, it is logically possible that a person...
そうですね、メールはそのですね。170円しかないから。これはやばい。Himself a philosophical naturalist, agrees that trying to rule out intelligent design in terms of demarcation criteria on the basis of methodological naturalism is both unnecessary and, it seems to me, a tactical mistake. Lastly, Belgian philosopher of science and atheist Martin Boudry, evaluating the status of methodological naturalism, argues that the most widespread view, which conceives of methodological naturalism as an intrinsic or self-imposed limitation of science, is philosophically indefensible. But why would atheists and philosophical naturalism worry about methodological naturalism? It is clear from their writings that care at all what materialistic theories of evolution shall prevail in a fair competition, winning their place in a science because these theories explain the data better than any design-based competitors. As Sarkar stresses, natural philosophy, as well as naturalistic theories of evolution, should be defeasible, that is, possibly wrong. Most importantly, he writes, since naturalism is derived from experience, it, as well as any other philosophical position, is fallible, just like the claims of science. Objection: do not non-naturalistic theories commit the God of the gaps fallacy. Defenders of methodological naturalism frequently justify its prohibition against non-materialistic explanation by claiming that any such explanation for the origin of new forms of life, such as intelligent design or special creation, would necessarily commit a God of the gaps fallacy. According to those who raise this objection, a God of the gaps fallacy occurs when proponents of design or creation invoke the activity of a designing intelligence or creator to explain some unexplained phenomenon or feature of the natural world. By searching for naturalistic or materialistic causes only, the objection continues, we avoid inserting God, or mind, or intelligence into the gap in our understanding, a gap that will inevitably be filled by genuine knowledge of a physical, material, and natural mechanism or process. But to what does the word gaps in this objection refer? Imagine someone who mistakenly enters an art gallery expecting to find croissants on sale. That is, someone who thinks that the gallery is a fancy bakery where pastries and rolls are sold. Such a person may think he has encountered a puzzle about the wares provided by the business. He may even think that he has a gap in his knowledge of what must definitely be present somewhere in the museum. I cannot see the baked goods, so they must keep them in the back room. Clever minimalism. The moral of our little story, the gallery visitor sees an unsolved puzzle or perceives a gap in his knowledge about the location of the baked goods. Both the puzzle and the gap, however, derive from his false assumption that he has walked into a bakery. In
In a similar way, perceived gaps in our knowledge of natural processes responsible for given phenomena, features of the world, are based on our background assumption about the kinds of processes or entities that ought to be present in nature. In the debate about biological origins, theistic evolutionists and mainstream evolutionary biologists assume that all living systems necessarily were produced by some naturalistic process, and their origin will thus ultimately have a completely naturalistic or materialistic explanation. Skipping a couple paragraphs, theistic evolutionists use the God of the Gaps objection to justify the claim that scientists should consider only materialistic evolutionary theories to explain the origin of new living forms. That is, they use it to justify methodological naturalism. Yet their use of the God of the Gaps objection to justify methodological naturalism ultimately begs the question, why? Because the claims that gaps in our knowledge of materialistic evolutionary processes constitutes an actual gap in knowledge of how life forms came to be, assumes that materialistic evolutionary mechanisms must have produced new forms of life, and thus must explain the origin of these forms. But that is simply the assumption of materialism, metaphysical and methodological, in another form. Yet methodological naturalism or materialism or naturalism is precisely what theistic evolutionists invoke fear of the God of the Gaps fallacy to justify. Skipping a couple of paragraphs, seen in this light, the God of the Gaps objection fades into insignificance. To have force, theistic evolutionists must first show that we have genuine gaps in our knowledge of the materialistic causes of the origin of new forms of life. That is, that we have grounds for thinking that present gaps will ultimately be filled with knowledge of an actual natural process or mechanism capable of biological innovation. But this, as we showed in chapters 1 through